In human history, there has been a lot of wars, small and big, long and short. But one war is known as the deadliest war of all, and that's World War I. The amount of people that died in this war compared to the population of the world at that time was insane. 40 million people died because of this war. The soldiers back then were put in a bad situation, and we could say being a World War I soldier was probably one of the hardest things in the world. No food, no water, dead corpse with a bunch of disease on them, disgusting rats that eat the dead bodies and spread disease. Explaining this has already made me very scared to be in that situation. But let's go back to 1914 and see what life was like for a World War I soldier. You have to know that in 1914, World War I started. And the countries that were involved was Britain, France, Germany, Ottoman Empire, and Russia. It's good to know that World War I was one of the first wars that had trenches. And obviously, it was to cover up so they can shoot at the enemy from the trenches. Basically, the war was between two armies and they would hold a line between trenches. And in the middle, it was nothing. And it's very famous to call this place no man's land. And that basically means no man will stay alive if they enter it, because they will be shot instantly. Even though they used trenches way after World War I, and the soldier was technically out of danger, but it was a swamp of disease and dirtiness. And you could say most soldiers died because of the condition they were put in, rather than the bullets they got shot with. Just like we said, in these trenches, there was a bunch of disease. This is a map of a trench, and they believe this is the best way to resist the enemy, because if anyone enters no man's land, they will be shot from multiple directions. We talk a lot about the trenches, but we have to say this as well. They will make these trenches at the borders so the enemy can't move forward anymore. It wasn't because they wanted to gain land. The soldiers in the front line had the worst life. Most of the time, at the bottom, it was full of mud, and you had to walk inside the mud, and that was usually with ripped up boots. As you know, it's Northern Europe. The weather is cold, the boots are ripped, there is wet mud underneath you, and you could say all this cold water and mud made people get trench foot. What we just explained to you guys caused 75,000 British soldiers to lose their foot, and that was all because of the conditions of the trench. And there was a lot of disease beside these. Even though there were medics at the trenches, but there were so many injured that they couldn't help most of them. And to put it short is that soldiers would sit in this trench, eat, sleep, fight, go to the bathroom, and eventually die. Everything would happen in these trenches. But another living thing was in these trenches, a disgusting animals that everybody hates, rats. And these creatures killed a lot of soldiers because of the disease they carried. Did you guys see the conditions? It gets worse in 1915. This is the year the German soldiers started to use chemical weapons. Chlorine gas was everywhere. The year 1917 is the year the US entered World War I, and they would answer the Germans with chemical weapons as well. You guys know Harry Truman, the president that ordered the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. He was a World War I veteran, and it's in his biography that he was responsible for using chemical weapons on the Germans. but back then it was normal. The Germans started to use it, and the Americans answered. In this war, at least 500,000 young soldiers were killed because of chemical weapons. And how would you die with chemical weapons? A slow, painful death, because they didn't even know what to do with an injured one. Basically, a World War I soldier was doomed. They would either die of diseases, or they would be shot, or they would be attacked by chemical weapons, or they would stay alive and come home. But if they would come back, they would be shell-shocked. Basically, shell shock is an extreme case of PTSD, and back then they would say their soul has been demolished. There was a different level of shell shock, and if someone was farther from the battle, they would be less shell shocked. But World War I was one of the worst case scenarios for post-traumatic stress disorder, because in World War II, they kinda learned from what's going on. But it's not like World War II was any better. It was just not as bad as World War I. If you want to say the worst things about World War I, we're gonna be here until tomorrow. The soldiers that were shell-shocked, a lot of them couldn't fight anymore, and they had to quit. You might not believe it, but in the British Army, 300 of these soldiers were executed for cowardness. What did these soldiers eat in these trenches? Potatoes and weeks-old bread. 1916, there was a shortage of flour, and the bread was gone, and it was only potatoes left. And that is why Europeans have a lot of different ways for cooking potatoes, because in those years, that's all they had to eat. Most of the time, the soldiers in the trenches had to be standing up and looking out, because they could attack all of a sudden, and that is why they had to be looking out all the time. Most of the time, half the soldiers would be standing up for lookout or shooting, and the other half were taking a break. And the breaks were going to the bathroom. They would cook or warm up food. They also had playing cards if they were bored. And when the magazine and newspaper would come into the trenches, they would read it and pass it along. Between the magazines and newspapers, there were jokes as well, and that was to keep their spirit up. One of the most interesting things that happened in World War I was on December 24, 1914, Christmas Eve. In those years, one soldier from one trench and the other from the other trench, they enter no man's land. They shake each other's hand, and soldiers from both sides come join in the middle, and because of Christmas, they don't fight. They don't fight that night, but they go back into the trenches and resume the war the next day. This was the choice of the soldiers. And when the commanders found out what happened, they said never do that again, and nothing like this ever happened again. This was a situation for a World War I soldier, and the frontline soldiers of every country was in a situation like this, and one country wasn't better than the other. This war took 4 years, and in the end, Germany had lost, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the Communist Revolution happened in Russia, and the main winners were Britain, US, and France. And the entire cost of the war and the entire blame was put on Germany. And they told Germany it was all their fault and they started the war, and you have to pay for everything. A lot of people say what happened to Germany in World War I caused the Nazis to come into power and make themselves ready for World War II. And you guys pretty much know the rest of this.